The United States has a trade deficit. Is that bad? Does it matter much at all? Well, joining us to help answer that question is one of the most astute observers of the public policy arena and economics issues, Professor Donald Boudreaux of George Mason University. Thanks for joining us.
I'm happy to be back.
So we do have this trade deficit, and a lot of people say, this is terrible. We need to do something about it. Do we need to do anything about the trade deficit?
No. No. We've had a trade deficit for straight now going on almost 40 years. If you look at most of U.S. history going back to 1607 when the English settled Jamestown, the vast majority of those years has been trade deficits. A trade deficit is just a fancy name for foreigners investing a lot in your country. And that's not bad. That's good because more capital comes into America. That creates jobs, that expands businesses, that creates new products, that raises wages, that increases the capital value of people's homes and assets. You can tell a story in which trade deficits are a symptom of something bad, but it's kind of a strained story. But in the case of the United States, we run a trade deficit because compared to other countries, we remain an attractive investment destination. Property rights are still reasonably secure. There's still a rule of law. We still largely have a market-oriented economy with a lot of dynamism. We have a large market. All of those factors attract capital here. People want to invest their money here. And so when they sell us things, when foreigners sell us things, rather than cash out all of their dollars immediately buying American exports, they take some of those dollars and they invest them in the United States. The dollars come back to the U.S. They just come back differently than they would come back if they were all for exports. And it's the difference in how they come back that leads to this artifact, this accounting artifact called the trade deficit. But it sounds bad. And Mitch, I've talked about this issue now for 20 years pretty solidly, and I follow it very closely. And I guarantee this is not exaggeration. I would say that 90% of the news reporters, the editorial writers, the news media, even in some of the better business journals like the Wall Street Journal, 90% don't know what the trade deficit is. They just hear trade deficit. Deficit sounds bad. Therefore, the trade deficit must be bad. They equate it with increasing debt. Sounds like the government budget deficit. It's not the same thing at all. And so because it has a bad-sounding name, and people keep repeating over and over again that it spells our doom or it's a symptom of our bad practices, that it must be bad. It's not bad. By and large, I think it's a good, healthy sign, and it also promotes economic health better than that health would be in the absence of the trade deficit.
That is the voice of Donald Boudreaux, professor of economics at George Mason University. You mentioned that trade deficit, just the term sounds bad.
Sounds bad.
But aren't there other factors also contributing to why so many people think it actually is bad, sort of the old mercantilist view of the economy?
Yes, it's a mercantilist concept. It dates back to centuries long before the Industrial Revolution. I like what Adam Smith said about the whole balance of trade doctrine. The trade deficit is part of this whole balance of trade issue. And I quote Adam Smith, quote, "Nothing, however, can be as absurd as this whole doctrine of the balance of trade," end quote. It's a completely absurd doctrine. It's premised on the notion, which is the mercantilist notion, that countries are like businesses. They're just like big businesses. And a country succeeds in trade the more it exports and the less it imports, with the difference being made up by a receipt of money. As Adam Smith pointed out, people can't eat money. People can't house themselves in money. Money is a medium of exchange. Money is valuable only insofar as ordinary men and women can use that money to buy the goods and services that make their lives better off, that raise their standards of living. And so it's not, contrary to the mercantilist notion, contrary to the trade deficit fear, it's not a bad thing when Americans import. It's a good thing. Imports are the benefit we get from trading. Unfortunately, we have to pay for those imports, and exports are the price we pay. This is the complete opposite of the mercantilist myth that sees exports as a benefit. Wow, we're giving stuff away to foreigners, and imports as a cost we have to pay. Wow, and in exchange, we're getting all these consumer electronics and cars and petroleum and clothing. How terrible. We got to minimize that. But this is the notion that the Trump people have, and it's completely wrong. but in fairness to the Trump people, they are just more open and consistent in their mercantilism, more blatant about their embrace of this myth than most other politicians. There are exceptions, but you show me a politician, I'll scratch that politician and I will find a mercantilist not too far beneath the surface.
Not to get overly wonkish, but some people look at a particular statistic called gross domestic product as one of the greatest things that you should be focusing on in terms of the economy. And if you do focus on GDP, one of its components is exports over imports. So you would think we need to have more exports than imports. Why is that wrong?
Well, it's wrong for a couple of different reasons, and it's hard not to get too terribly wonkish. I'll try to do it. I don't know if I'll succeed. When fashioned in its national income form, income equals consumption plus investment plus government spending minus exports minus imports. The consumption spending is already the dollars in consumption are already counted in C and I to the extent that investors spend. And so just to make the accounting work, just honestly, we have to, the international accountants have to subtract those expenditures that are made on imports. If we didn't, we'd count twice, right? So if I buy, well, I can think of a good example now without getting too wonkish. So at one level, it's just an accounting measure that's necessary to avoid double counting. A somewhat different reason that's complementary to that is when foreigners, as I said, when we run a trade deficit, what that means is foreigners are investing in America. And then when foreigners invest in America, that increases the size of our capital stock. We have more factories. We have improved factories. We have more worker R&D. Over time, that increases the productivity of the economy, which raises, if it's measured properly, GDP. There are lots of problems with using GDP as a measure of economic welfare. Putting those, I think it's okay. Putting those aside, over time, the trade deficit should result in higher GDP because it increases the productivity of the economy.
In general, has it been true that when our economy is operating as well as it can, we're operating with trade deficits and even larger trade deficits as things get better?
Oh, absolutely. All a trade deficit means is that foreigners are especially eager to invest in America. There's nothing wrong with that. Just nothing at all. But to invest in America, foreigners need dollars, and they get dollars by selling us stuff. So we gain. Each American voluntarily chooses or not to buy something from a foreigner. The foreigner voluntarily chooses or not how then to spend or to invest those monies. If all along the way each party gains from these many series of individual bilateral voluntary trades, how can it be that the overall result is negative? It only appears that way when we concoct and focus on these statistics, which I wish were not gathered, these national income, these balance of trade statistics. If I could change one thing about the past, I would go back to the past and I would kill in its crib this mercantilist monstrous idea of the balance of trade. It leads to nothing but confusion and bad policies. It's just a terrible idea. We don't collect balance of trade statistics between states. We don't collect balance of trade statistics between cities. Hong Kong doesn't collect balance of trade statistics on itself. And there's no reason that countries should collect balance of trade statistics. They are, to the extent they have any meaning, the meaning is very, very minimal. Right? It has no policy relevance. And by and large, they lead to nothing but bad outcomes.
So they
can be demagogued.
So the next time that we hear about trade deficits, we ought to just not worry at all.
You should not worry about it. Let me just say one other thing. People think, well, I get this all the time. Well, when we have a trade deficit, that means Americans are going further into debt. And the answer is no, it does not. A simple example. If I buy a car from Japan, so now someone in Japan has American dollars. If that Japanese person then opens up a restaurant using that money in Fairfax, Virginia, where I live. Well, that increases the trade deficit, but there's no debt there's no greater debt involved. No American owes this Japanese person anything as a result of this transaction. Some of the trade deficit can become debt to the extent that foreigners lend the money to us. Even that is not necessarily bad, but people mistake the trade deficit as they think that it necessarily, when it rises, that it necessarily means we Americans are going into debt by the amount of the rise in trade deficit. And that is simply factually false. It's about as factually false as anything can be.